Chinese President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart Joe Biden have met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. Ties between the two superpowers are at their lowest in decades, and not much was expected out of the meeting.
Both leaders discussed Taiwan, Russia's nuclear threats, and North Korea's nuclear program. There's also a possibility that climate cooperation might resume. China had paused talks on the climate crisis after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August. Well, joining us now is Bonnie Glaser for more on this meeting. Bonnie, President Biden and President Xi spent a lot of time together a decade ago when they were both vice presidents. Do you think that history contributed to the warmth of this encounter? And optics aside, would you describe the meeting as constructive?
Well, I think that the fact that the president spent so much time together about 10 years ago means that they are able to speak to each other very candidly, very directly, tell each other what they think. I'm not convinced that they have any special personal chemistry. I'm not sure that Xi Jinping has personal chemistry with any leader, although perhaps with Vladimir Putin. But this is the first time now since President Biden was inaugurated that they have met in person. And I think that Joe Biden really did want to re-engage directly, look at each other eye to eye and provide some reassurances to Xi Jinping, and he did that. He did underscore that the United States, for example, doesn't support Taiwan independence. The U.S. doesn't want a Cold War, doesn't want to decouple with China. So those were important messages that I think Xi Jinping really did want to hear. The meeting itself was constructive, and the biggest deliverable, if we want to call it that, is that they have instructed their senior officials to meet together to begin to address some of the problems in the relationship. And Secretary of State Tony Blinken will apparently at some future date be traveling to China. What will come out of those talks, of course, remains to be seen.
Yeah, Bonnie, there's no escaping the fact that as the number one and number two economies in the world, there's going to be competition in trade and technology, for political influence too. How can they compete and it not lead to conflict? Biden said he's looking to manage this competition responsibly.
Well, the Biden administration has been communicating to China from the beginning. Now it's almost 2 years that they want to manage the competition responsibly, and that they want to engage in talks with China, for example, about risk reduction measures, talk about strategic stability, which would involve nuclear weapons. And China, frankly, has been reluctant. They have at times demanded concessions from the United States, said that there has to be a positive atmosphere before they can really engage in any serious talks. Sometimes they've even ridiculed the notion of guardrails. So this is one of the reasons why I'm a bit skeptical. Of course, yes, it's inevitable that there would be friction between a rising power and the existing power. But the kind of intense competition that is taking place between the United States and China is in part a function of the different political systems that they have. And the differences between the United States are growing in some ways. We have difference of interests in places like Taiwan, but also other places and on other issues. So the question is whether we can find some common ground on some issues to work together. And I think many of our allies and partners around the world hope that the United States and China can talk about climate change, about global health, and particularly about food security, which was also a subject that President Biden raised with Xi Jinping.
In the lead up to this meeting, Biden was busy bolstering relations with allies in Asia. He spoke to leaders of Japan, South Korea, and Australia, connected with others at the ASEAN summit in Cambodia. Biden says he wants cooperation and not conflict with China, and yet he is still courting nations to take up the American cause. Can you square that up for us?
Well, the United States believes that aligning with allies is important in order to protect our shared interests and our shared values, and also to compete with China. In the strategy speech that Tony Blinken gave earlier this year, he did talk about the strategy of investing in America, aligning with our allies, and then using the progress that we make in both of those areas to compete more effectively with China. The Biden administration has said and continues to believe they want to deal with China from a position of strength. That is something that Beijing doesn't like the president to say. They don't want that to be U.S. strategy. But if we deal with China by ourselves, we are weaker. And after all, we do share common interests and values with our allies. And they, too, want to protect things like supply chains and our democracies.
And Bonnie, China has drawn a red line on the issue of Taiwan. Its stated long-term goal is reunification. Biden, meanwhile, has said he would defend Taiwan militarily if China tried to take it by force. It doesn't seem like much ground to maneuver.
Well, I think the goal of the differences over Taiwan really should be managing the competition, avoiding war. The United States has repeatedly said it does not support an independent Taiwan, and President Biden said that again today. He also said a few things that U.S. presidents have not said for a while. He said that the United States doesn't support two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. I think actually that China will see that as an important statement. And President Biden later said in a press conference that he doesn't believe that China has the intent to use force against Taiwan in the near term. So I see this as an effort by the United States to provide some reassurances, to dial down some of the competition and the friction in the relationship. But at the same time, Biden did highlight that the United States is opposed to China's use of coercion and its increasingly aggressive behavior against Taiwan. So the question really is whether they can engage in a dialogue to prevent risks and accidents, and also whether China maybe is willing to reverse some of its more bellicose behavior. Ever since U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan last August, there has been a very high level of Chinese military activity across the center line of the Taiwan Strait, with naval ships and also the PLA Air Force. And I think the hope of the United States is that China will return to the status quo ante. But that will be difficult because I think China sees that it has changed the status quo in its favor, and I doubt that it will easily give that up.
All right. Always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much, Bonnie. That was Bonnie Glaser, director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States.